Hi and welcome back to a new video. As promised, today we will take a closer look at the RTX 5090 Founders Edition and what Nvidia announced in their keynote, which I watched Tuesday morning because it was late at night here, German time. And I have to say, honestly, I was quite impressed about their keynote. Not only how it was presented, the animations, and people can make as many jokes as they want about Jensen and the leather jacket and stuff, but he's very good at these presentations. I have a lot of respect for that, and also the quality, how they made it, was absolutely insane. Also things like Nvidia Omniverse, Nvidia Cosmos, that was absolutely impressive. And I felt like, watching a movie, looking into the future. I can definitely recommend, if you have 1.5 hours to spare and if you want to suffer to listen to AI too many times, then it's still recommended to do so. We already checked the keynotes from AMD and Intel in terms of their AI performance, and AMD was doing quite well. Now, how did Nvidia deliver? They were mentioning the word AI 140 times within the 91 minutes of presentation, so that gives them a performance of 1.53 AI mentions per minute, which is like second spot directly behind Intel. But unfortunately, Nvidia, you couldn't quite beat AMD in terms of AI mentioning. I think it's maybe an unfair advantage that AMD named their CPU AI, Ryzen AI, whatever. So that is one AI mention every 39 seconds, which means that unfortunately, Nvidia, you didn't win here. Maybe next time. This video is powered by Seasonic's Prime TX 1600 watt premium PSU. With a peak efficiency of 94% at 50% load, this PSU is 80 plus titanium and cybernetics titanium certified. I've been using Seasonic Prime PSUs myself for years in extreme overclocking scenarios, and I was never disappointed. All necessary safety features are in place, such as OPP, OVP, OCP and OTP, and will make sure that your system is running as stable and safe as possible. I also find it impressive that Seasonic is so convinced of their own quality that these PSUs come with a warranty of 12 years. That is just impressive. So make sure to check out Seasonic's Prime TX 1600 watt PSU in the link below. Before we proceed looking at the RTX 5090 in detail, I quickly want to talk about the performance expectation of the 5090 versus the 5080. So we will look at this chart where you can see the 4090 in gray and the new 5090 marked in green. Now, as a lot of you already noticed, it is pretty difficult to get a real impression of the performance difference simply because they were running different scenarios. Now, with the 5090 and running DLSS 4, also multi-frame generation, the multi-frame generation can generate up to 3 frames per native frame with AI. And that means that it's hard to compare with the 4090 that does the normal frame generation, where you have one native frame and one AI generated frame. If we specifically look at Far Cry 6, that is all the way on the left in this chart. This one is not using DLSS, it's just using ray tracing. And we can do simple pixel measurement in the chart. 100% of the 4090 equals 158 pixels. And if we then measure the green bar next to it, this one is 202 pixels high. And if we just compare this is a plus of 27% additional performance. Now also again next to it, a Plague Tale Requiem, which only supports DLSS 3. That means that the RTX 5090 cannot make use of the multi-frame generation of DLSS 4. That allows also again a better comparison, and again here with pixel measurement we can get a performance increase from 4090 to 5090 of plus 44%. This performance increase of about 30% that we saw in Far Cry 6 in this chart kind of aligns with the rest of the specification, also aligns with the additional power draw that Nvidia communicated. With 575 watts, that's a plus of 28% over the 4090. But again, I want to remind you that typically a 4090 in gaming scenarios doesn't draw the 450 watts. It's more between 350 and 400 watts. And if Blackwell, the 5090, behaves about the same, then I would expect more like 500 watts under load. The 5090 also has 33% more CUDA cores and also has much faster memory. We have 1.8 terabyte per second versus the 4090 only having 1 terabyte per second. And that is specifically interesting if you look at how the 4090 behaves with overclocking. If you have a 4090 and you just push the core without touching the memory, there's not much happening. But as soon as you touch the memory and overclock it, a lot happens. Like the 4090 is definitely memory bottlenecked, not by the capacity, but by the memory speed. And with the faster memory, I think the 5090 will definitely benefit. If we just look at native rendering, and after all the information we gathered from the keynote and all the specs, I think with native rendering we can expect additional 20 to 30% over the 4090 with the 5090. This might not be as much as some other people expect, but I don't think that it's disappointing. Especially, we have to keep in mind that it kind of neglects the additional features. And I know that a lot of people are, calling it fake frames and DLSS and just want to see native rendering performance like comparison. But also for my personal preference and like what I personally use on a gaming rig, I think a lot of the people or the majority are using the DLSS features in the end because it just gives them more performance and at the same time usually also less power draw. And that is something we definitely have to investigate once we get the card, once we can get proper reviews. But yeah, of course, if we just look at a native rendering, it might only be 20 to 30%. But I could be wrong also, that's something I want to highlight. That's just my personal assumption. I could be wrong. But we have to keep in mind that, there's more to that than just the native rendering. And also in terms of efficiency, it means that there will probably not be a big difference between the 4090 and the 5090. If it's additional 30% of native rendering performance for the 5090, but it also has about 30% extra power draw, it means that the efficiency is roughly the same. And all those DLSS features, people have to keep in mind, especially looking at this slide that kind of went viral and a lot of people like panicked and wanted to throw their 4090 already out of the window for, I don't know, like $1,000. And obviously an RTX 5070 will not beat a 4090 in native rendering. It might be that if you run a 4090 with maybe even DLSS, versus a 5070 with DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation, it might be that a 5070 in this specific scenario can be faster. But if you compare the exact same scenario, the 4090 will always be faster. I mean, the 5080 is already slower than a 4090, so yeah, just don't do stupid actions. A 4090 is still a very good card. We spent the past 2 days here at Grizzly analyzing the 5090 to the core. And that is quite interesting, and I'm pretty sure you also already noticed all of this looking at the fact that Nvidia is able to dissipate 575 watts through a 2-slot design. That is kind of incredible. And Joe, so we just switched downstairs to Joe into the R&D office. So Joe, next to me, spent the previous, I think, more than 24 hours.
Yeah,
on
about a day's work.
turning the card from images and stuff into a CAD model that we can explain to you how the RTX 5090 is built.
Okay, so the starting point for it was we had a really nice front-on and top-down image of the card. And from the PCIe slot and the I/O bracket, then there's a really good scale for how big the card is.
Yeah.
And I first made the outside shape of the aluminium frame because that's either extruded or milled, so it can't change on its way through the card. And then what fits inside the outside shapes is probably what's there.
So we are quite sure, well, this is not perfectly what Nvidia made, but we are quite sure that this is pretty close to it, right?
Yeah, from all the parts that are on the outside, I think must be within 0.5 millimeter, which is quite good. The inside things get more interesting because some parts weren't in the renders, they weren't in the keynote, and we're just making them up.
Yeah, especially for the internals. I mean, the big question was how the 5090 is made when it comes to the PCBs inside. And there, I think we just had to guess and play with what is possible.
Yeah, so the PCB for the core obviously had to fit within the frame. So we know how wide it is. There was a relatively good picture of that we could flatten out from the images from CES, and we know how big the memory modules are and scaled everything from those.
Awesome. None of the following might be correct, but Joe is quite sure that it's pretty close to reality. And thanks to Nvidia sharing a lot of images and animations and also the media afterwards, sharing a lot of infos from CES about the 5090, I think we got quite a good impression, and Joe was probably able to reverse engineer the 5090. We are pretty sure that RTX 5090 Founders Edition consists out of 3 PCBs. We have the main one sitting in the center that contains the Blackwell chip, memory, also everything regarding voltage supply, and also on the side a single 12-volt high power connector. On the back of this main PCB we spotted 2 connections, and they were also visible in the keynote presentation. And just by the fact of how these connectors look like, we are quite sure that the top left one is a PCIe board-to-board connector that is to connect 2 PCBs with each other. We spotted a similar connector from Amphenol for PCIe 5.0, even rated. You can see this right here. So it's definitely possible and makes sense that this type of connector would be for this speed for the connection of the PCIe 5.0 slot. The second connector on the main PCB is probably for the third PCB for the I/O area. So that should be where you connect your DisplayPort or HDMI to your display output. We assume it looks something like this. So from the main PCB again, the flexible ribbon cable would go down and then to the right to the I/O area where we have the third PCB. And this PCB, Nvidia probably tried to keep as small as possible to not obstruct the airflow, with the fan sitting underneath and blowing towards us. And that's why I think they just want to keep this very tiny. The second PCB that forms the PCIe connection between the main PCB and the motherboard should look something like this. And we're also quite sure about the shape here, simply because there is just no other space available. If we look at the backplate here, you can also spot 4 of the mounting holes, which would absolutely make sense. And the shape that is left just leaves only this space for this PCB. The main PCB also has this additional backplate, which is definitely to dissipate more heat in addition. Joe also just copied the I/O PCB from an RTX 4090, just cut it down, but I think that kind of makes sense. If we hide everything that belongs to heatsink and case, the Nvidia RTX 5090 Founders Edition should look something like this. With the main PCB in the center, the additional small PCB for the PCIe connection to the motherboard slot, and again the third small PCB that contains DisplayPort and HDMI. It is also possible that Nvidia uses a similar type of solution, and yes, Makita is meowing in the background, but you might have seen this in the Gamers Nexus video where he was taking apart the 4090 prototype, and this showed kind of like a PCB with a flexible part. That might also be possible. But I think Nvidia might prefer just a solid solution that might be cheaper. Excuse me, did you want to say anything in the video? Nvidia apparently is also using liquid metal on the RTX 5090 Founders Edition, which is something I couldn't directly get confirmed from Nvidia yet, which makes sense, we're still before the embargo lift, but at least OC3D reported about it, and if you think about it, it also kind of makes sense. It seems like Nvidia tried everything to make it possible to squeeze this card into a 2-slot design. And if you can maybe optimize the temperature by a few degrees Celsius by using liquid metal, that sounds plausible to me, but it's something we definitely have to check out once we have the card in our hands. Another thing that is absolutely mind-blowing is the heatsink design itself. There are some small but tiny and very interesting aspects, something I have not seen before. You maybe saw this in some of the images also in the presentation, that the area directly above the fans is a little bit curved. It looks like the center piece above the fans is curved inwards, which is pretty unusual. It means that this area in the center of the fan location is a little bit thinner. The reason again for this could be further optimization for cooling and also airflow. Pretty sure Nvidia did this for a reason, and if you think about just a normal fan, doesn't have a uniform airflow. It has a more static or higher static pressure on the side versus the center. So they maybe improved this by I don't know, making the resistance of the fins a little bit less in the center, but that's just an assumption. This tiny detail blew me away completely. There's this tiny bend in each single fin. And if I counted correctly, we have 58 fins on each heatsink stack. And what is kind of unusual and absolutely crazy is that every single fin is bent a little bit different. So the first one has a strong curvature inwards, and every repeating one is a little bit less bent. And again, here I'm pretty sure they did this for some kind of cooling optimization. And what's so crazy about this is the manufacturing of these fins. And typically, if you design a heatsink, you will try to make all those fins have exactly the same shape because they're stamped. You might have seen this in my video visiting Deepcool factory, where we took a look at how one of those heatsinks is made. And it's basically just made from some aluminum sheet metal, and then it's stamped. In conclusion, this means that Nvidia probably had to design 58 individual stamping tools. For every single fin, they needed a different stamping tool. Otherwise, it's just not possible to make a different curve inside the fin itself. And typically, you want to be cost efficient. You try to design your heatsink ideally with just one single fin design, and like more complex coolers, typically they might have 3, 4, or even 5 different fin designs, and this one has 58. That's absolutely crazy, and this also shows the dedication of Nvidia they put into the design of this cooler. They definitely did not cheap out, not for a single cent. I'm pretty sure this is the most expensive air cooler I have ever seen in this industry. And that is even if you compare it with like 5090 Astral or whatever other beefy heatsinks you have. They might be big, but they usually use a single or like 2 or 3 different tools for the stamping and not 58. One of those stamping tools, they start in the 4 figures. So cheaper one might be, I don't know, $2,000, $3,000. A more complex one definitely can be between $5,000 and $10,000 just for a stamping tool. And 58, yeah, maybe Nvidia invested just $500,000 just into stamping tools. Completely crazy. To end this video, I want to give you a gentle reminder of what happens when GPUs launch. People seem to forget RTX 30 launch or RTX 40 launch. It's always the same. It could be that Nvidia is advertising this for $1999, and it could be that you're lucky to get one of these maybe in the Nvidia store for the MSRP. But any other card, it will depend on supply and demand. The prices in every single industry are not dictated by any vendor or whatever. It is always supply and demand. And if the supply is maybe bad on the first few days, the card might just cost more. It is always like that. Just always be aware and don't just sell your 4090s now. Just don't. All right, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Bye-bye.